August 9, 1945. The sun rose over Hanoi as Ho Chi Minh stood before a massive crowd in Ba Dinh Square, his voice trembling with emotion as he declared Vietnam's independence from France. Few among the thousands gathered could have imagined that this moment of liberation would plant the seeds for one of the 20th century's most devastating conflicts, a war that would consume millions of lives and divide the world into opposing camps. Ho Chi Minh's declaration came just days after Japan's surrender in World War II, ending their brutal occupation of Vietnam. The revolutionary leader borrowed directly from America's own Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal and possess certain inalienable rights. Standing beside him were American Office of Strategic Services officers who had worked with his Viet Minh guerrillas against the Japanese. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Vietnam might forge a partnership with the United States. But history had other plans. The roots of Vietnam's tragedy stretched back decades before Ho's declaration. France had colonized Indochina in the 1860s, establishing a brutal system of exploitation that drained Vietnam's resources and crushed its people under merciless taxation. By the early 1900s, Vietnamese nationalists were already organizing resistance movements. Ho Chi Minh himself left Vietnam in 1911 aboard a French steamer, beginning a 30-year journey through Europe, America, and the Soviet Union that would transform him from a kitchen worker into a committed communist revolutionary. According to historian Frederick Logevall's Embers of War, France's determination to reclaim its colonial empire after World War II directly contradicted Vietnamese aspirations for self-determination. When French forces returned to Vietnam in 1945, they found a population that had tasted independence and refused to surrender it. Ho Chi Minh attempted to negotiate with France throughout 1946, sending desperate letters to President Harry Truman that went unanswered. America remained silent, choosing to support its European ally rather than the anti-colonial movement. The First Indochina War erupted in December 1946, when French warships bombarded the port city of Haiphong, killing thousands of Vietnamese civilians. This brutal attack transformed simmering tensions into open warfare. The Viet Minh retreated to the countryside, launching a guerrilla campaign that would persist for 8 bloody years. France poured resources into maintaining control, but the costs, both financial and human, mounted relentlessly. America's involvement began subtly. Concerned about communist expansion after China's revolution in 1949, the Truman administration started funding France's war effort. By 1954, the United States was paying nearly 80% of France's military costs in Vietnam. American policymakers operated under the domino theory, the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow like toppling dominoes. The decisive moment came at Dien Bien Phu in spring 1954. French forces, confident in their superior firepower, established a fortress in a remote valley surrounded by jungle-covered hills. General Von Nguyen Giap, commanding the Viet Minh forces, orchestrated a masterpiece of military strategy. His soldiers hand-carried heavy artillery piece by piece through impossible terrain, positioning them in the hills overlooking the French position. The siege lasted 57 days, ending with France's humiliating defeat on May 7, 1954. This catastrophic loss forced France to negotiate, but rather than bringing peace, Dien Bien Phu's aftermath created the conditions that would ultimately drag America into its own Vietnamese nightmare. July 21, 1954. Diplomats from 9 nations gathered in Geneva's elegant Palais des Nations, their faces grave as they signed accords that would temporarily divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel. This temporary partition, meant to last only until nationwide elections in 1956, would instead congeal into a permanent division that set the stage for decades of bloodshed. The Geneva Conference created 2 Vietnams. In the north, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam controlled territory from the Chinese border to just below the 17th parallel. In the south, the state of Vietnam, initially led by the former Emperor Bao Dai, occupied the remaining territory with substantial American backing. The accords explicitly stated that the military demarcation line was provisional and should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary. Yet this provisional line would become a battle line. Nearly 1 million Vietnamese, many of them Catholics, fled from north to south during the 300-day period when movement between zones was permitted. American ships assisted this exodus as part of Operation Passage to Freedom, a humanitarian effort that doubled as anti-communist propaganda. The refugees' stories of religious persecution and communist brutality in the north strengthened American resolve to prevent South Vietnam's fall. But hundreds of thousands also moved northward, including many Viet Minh fighters who expected to return south after the promised elections. Those elections never happened. Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch Catholic nationalist who became South Vietnam's prime minister in June 1954, refused to participate. Diem understood that Ho Chi Minh, a genuine national hero who had led resistance against both Japan and France, would win any fair nationwide vote. President Dwight Eisenhower privately acknowledged this reality, estimating in his memoirs that Ho would receive 80% of the vote if elections were held. According to Philip Catton's research detailed in Diem's final failure, the South Vietnamese leader faced an impossible task. Diem inherited a fractured society where regional warlords, religious sects, and criminal organizations wielded more power than the central government. The Binh Xuyen syndicate controlled Saigon's police force and profited from prostitution and opium trafficking. The Cao Dai and Hoa Hao religious sects maintained private armies numbering tens of thousands. French intelligence officers, reluctant to cede influence, undermined Diem at every turn. Diem proved remarkably ruthless in consolidating power. Throughout 1955, he systematically destroyed his rivals. He bought off some Cao Dai leaders, attacked the Binh Xuyen's headquarters in Saigon with artillery, and subdued the Hoa Hao through military force and political maneuvering. By October 1955, Diem felt secure enough to depose Emperor Bao Dai through a rigged referendum where he claimed 98% of the vote, including impossible margins like 600,000 votes in Saigon, a city with only 450,000 registered voters. American advisors watched these developments with mixed feelings. Diem's authoritarianism troubled them, but his fierce anti-communism and apparent effectiveness at restoring order seemed promising. The Eisenhower administration poured aid into South Vietnam, over $1 billion between 1955 and 1961. American military advisors arrived to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. American economists designed programs to modernize agriculture and industry. South Vietnam became Washington's showcase for nation-building in the developing world. But Diem's methods sowed the seeds of future disaster. His government's overwhelmingly Catholic leadership alienated the Buddhist majority. His brother Ngo Dinh Nhu established a secret police force that tortured and imprisoned thousands of suspected communists and dissidents. Diem's land reform program, designed to win peasant loyalty, failed spectacularly because corrupt officials and landlords sabotaged it. In the villages where most Vietnamese lived, Diem's government appeared as a new oppressor replacing the old French masters. In the north, Ho Chi Minh faced his own challenges consolidating communist rule, including a brutal land reform campaign that killed thousands. But by late 1959, with reunification through elections impossible, Hanoi made a fateful decision. It would support armed revolution in the south. December 20th, 1960. Deep in the jungles of Tay Ninh province, representatives from various resistance groups gathered in secret to establish the National Liberation Front. This coalition of communists, Buddhists, students, peasants, and nationalists united around a single goal: overthrowing Ngo Dinh Diem's government and reunifying Vietnam. American officials would dismiss the NLF as a puppet organization controlled entirely by Hanoi, calling its fighters Viet Cong, a derogatory term meaning Vietnamese communists. But this oversimplification missed the genuine grievances driving thousands of South Vietnamese to join the insurgency. The revolution's resurrection came after years of Diem's savage repression. Following the Geneva Accords, perhaps 10,000 Viet Minh fighters had remained in the South, burying their weapons and waiting for the promised elections. Between 1955 and 1959, Diem's security forces hunted them relentlessly. Tens of thousands of people, many with no communist connections whatsoever, disappeared into prisons and re-education camps. Villages suspected of harboring insurgents faced collective punishment. Diem's Republic of Vietnam executed an estimated 12,000 people during these anti-communist denunciation campaigns. This brutality had precisely the opposite effect that Diem intended. Rather than destroying the revolutionary movement, the repression drove desperate fighters back to armed resistance. In January 1959, the Central Committee of the Workers' Party in Hanoi, responding to desperate pleas from Southern communists, authorized a return to armed struggle. By the time the National Liberation Front formally organized in December 1960, the insurgency was already gathering unstoppable momentum. The insurgent strategy combined political organization with guerrilla warfare. Cadres infiltrated villages at night, holding meetings where they listened to peasants' grievances about land, taxes, and corruption. They assassinated government officials known for cruelty and replaced them with responsive local leadership. Where Diem's government appeared distant and predatory, the NLF positioned itself as the peasants' protector. According to documentation reviewed in David Hunt's Vietnam's Southern Revolution, this political work proved far more important than military operations in winning popular support. Weapons and fighters began flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia that connected North and South Vietnam. Initially just rough footpaths where porters carried supplies on bicycles, the trail would eventually become a sophisticated logistics network with truck routes, underground storage facilities, and anti-aircraft defenses. By 1961, the North was sending roughly 500 infiltrators southward monthly, along with weapons captured from defeated French forces. President John Kennedy inherited this deteriorating situation when he took office in January 1961. The young president had campaigned on fighting communist expansion more aggressively than Eisenhower. Vietnam appeared to be a test case for Kennedy's doctrine of flexible response, using counterinsurgency techniques rather than nuclear threats to combat communist movements in the developing world. The Pentagon convinced Kennedy that American military advisors could teach the South Vietnamese army how to defeat the insurgency, using tactics developed against guerrillas in Malaya and the Philippines. The advisor mission expanded dramatically. When Kennedy became president, roughly 700 American military personnel served in South Vietnam. By November 1963, that number had grown to 16,000. These advisors flew helicopter missions, directed artillery fire, and accompanied South Vietnamese units into combat. Young American pilots, believing they were preventing communist expansion, died in growing numbers. The Pentagon assured Kennedy that progress was being made, showing him statistics about enemy casualties and villages pacified. But these numbers painted a false picture. The harsh reality was that Diem's government was losing the countryside. Communist-controlled areas expanded steadily despite American aid and advice. South Vietnamese soldiers, poorly led and fighting for an unpopular regime, showed little enthusiasm for combat. Corruption riddled the military. Officers purchased their positions and embezzled their soldiers' pay. Meanwhile, NLF fighters, motivated by genuine conviction or revolutionary discipline, fought with remarkable tenacity and tactical sophistication. The war's character was transforming from a limited insurgency into something far more dangerous, drawing America deeper into a conflict it barely understood. June 11th, 1963. On a busy Saigon intersection, the 73-year-old Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc sat cross-legged in meditation as fellow monks poured gasoline over his body. He struck a match. Flames engulfed him instantly, yet he remained perfectly still as his body burned. Malcolm Brown, an Associated Press photographer, captured the horrifying scene in images that shocked the world and exposed the profound crisis consuming South Vietnam. This act of protest emerged from months of escalating tension between Diem's government and the Buddhist majority. The immediate trigger came on May 8, 1963, when government forces fired into crowds celebrating Buddha's birthday in the city of Hue, killing 9 people. Diem's Catholic government had banned the display of Buddhist flags, while allowing Catholic banners during recent celebrations honoring Diem's brother, Archbishop No Din Thuc. This blatant discrimination ignited Buddhist outrage that had been building for years. Diem's response to Quang Duc's self-immolation revealed his government's complete detachment from reality. His sister-in-law, Madame Nu, who functioned as South Vietnam's unofficial first lady since Diem was unmarried, callously described the immolation as a barbecue and offered to provide matches for future protests. Her husband, Ngo Dinh Nhu, directed security forces to raid Buddhist pagodas across the country on August 21, 1963. Special forces wearing regular army uniforms stormed the Sa Loi Pagoda in Saigon, beating monks and nuns with rifle butts and dragging hundreds off to prison. Similar raids occurred in Hue, Da Nang, and other cities. These attacks, conducted with American weapons and by troops trained by American advisors, created an impossible situation for the Kennedy administration. President Kennedy had publicly defended Diem for years, calling him the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. But images of burning monks and brutalized religious communities made this position increasingly untenable. American newspapers questioned whether Washington should continue supporting such a regime. Congress threatened to cut aid. Kennedy faced a dilemma: withdraw support and risk South Vietnam's collapse, or continue backing an increasingly unpopular dictator. Behind closed doors, American officials debated Diem's fate. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who arrived in Saigon in August 1963, quickly concluded that Diem must go. Lodge opened secret communications with South Vietnamese generals plotting a coup. According to declassified documents examined in Frederick Loggeval's Choosing War, Kennedy administration officials sent carefully worded cables indicating that America would not oppose a change in government, essentially giving the conspirators a green light. General Duong Van Minh, known as Big Min, led the plotting officers. On November 1, 1963, rebel forces surrounded the presidential palace while Min telephoned Diem, offering him safe passage into exile if he surrendered. Diem, who had survived previous coup attempts through cunning and ruthlessness, tried to stall. He and his brother Nhu secretly fled through an underground tunnel to a safe house in Cholon, Saigon's Chinese district. The next morning, after negotiating through intermediaries, the brothers agreed to surrender at a Catholic church. What happened next remains disputed. The official story claims that Diem and Nhu committed suicide in an armored personnel carrier transporting them to military headquarters. But overwhelming evidence suggests they were murdered on General Min's orders. Their bodies found with hands tied behind their backs, riddled with bullets and stabbed repeatedly. The brutality shocked even the coup's American supporters. President Kennedy reportedly went pale when informed of the murders, which occurred on November 2, 1963. 3 weeks later, on November 22, Kennedy himself died from an assassin's bullets in Dallas, Texas. These two assassinations, separated by just 21 days, marked a pivotal turning point. Diem's death eliminated the leader American policy had centered around for nearly a decade, while Kennedy's death brought to power Lyndon Johnson, a president with very different instincts about Vietnam. The coup's aftermath would prove disastrous. Rather than stability, Diem's overthrow initiated a chaotic period of revolving governments as generals competed for power. The National Liberation Front exploited this chaos brilliantly. With Saigon's government consumed by internal power struggles, communist forces expanded their control over the countryside. By early 1964, the NLF controlled or contested nearly half of South Vietnam's hamlets and villages. American military advisors filed increasingly pessimistic reports. The coup meant to save South Vietnam had instead accelerated its unraveling. The stage was set for massive American military intervention, a decision that would transform a local conflict into a war claiming millions of lives. August 4, 1964. In the dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, American destroyers USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy reported coming under attack from North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Radar operators detected incoming vessels. Sonar operators heard torpedo propeller sounds. The ships maneuvered frantically while firing into the darkness at phantom targets. This attack, which probably never occurred, would provide President Lyndon Johnson the justification to dramatically escalate American involvement in Vietnam, leading to a war that would consume his presidency and the nation. The Gulf of Tonkin incident actually consisted of two separate events. The first, on August 2nd, genuinely occurred. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the Maddox after it conducted electronic espionage operations near North Vietnamese naval facilities. The Maddox escaped undamaged, supported by carrier-based aircraft that sank or damaged several attacking boats. This attack came amid covert American operations supporting South Vietnamese commando raids against northern coastal targets, operations Hanoi viewed as acts of war. The alleged second attack on August 4th was far more questionable. Weather conditions that night were terrible, with thunderstorms creating false radar returns. The ship's sonar equipment picked up sounds that inexperienced operators interpreted as torpedoes but were likely just the destroyer's own propeller noise echoing off their rudders. Within hours, the task force commander, Captain John Herrick, sent a message urging Washington to review the evidence carefully because freak weather effects and overeager sonarman may have accounted for many reports. But political considerations in Washington overwhelmed caution. Johnson, campaigning for election against Senator Barry Goldwater, who advocated aggressive military action in Vietnam, needed to appear tough on communism without seeming reckless. The reported attack provided a perfect opportunity. Without waiting for conclusive evidence, Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval facilities and oil storage depots. 64 aircraft from the carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation bombed 4 torpedo boat bases and an oil storage facility at Vinh, destroying 25 boats and 90% of Vinh's oil storage capacity. More significantly, Johnson asked Congress for authorization to use military force. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by a vote of 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate. According to research presented in Edwin Moyse's Tonkin Gulf and the Escalation of the Vietnam War, this resolution granted Johnson authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Essentially, Congress gave the president a blank check for war without formally declaring war. The only senators voting against the resolution were Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska. Morse prophetically warned that history will record that we have made a great mistake in subverting and circumventing the Constitution of the United States by means of this resolution. His words would prove tragically accurate. Johnson used the resolution as legal justification for massive military escalation, sending hundreds of thousands of American troops to Vietnam without ever requesting a formal declaration of war. Throughout late 1964 and early 1965, conditions in South Vietnam continued deteriorating. A rapid succession of governments, 7 different regimes in 2 years, left Saigon paralyzed. General Nguyen Khan seized power in January 1964, only to be removed in a coup attempt in September, then restored, then forced out again in February 1965. This political chaos made effective military operations impossible. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam suffered devastating defeats. Communist forces now operated in battalion and regiment-sized units, conducting sophisticated operations that overwhelmed South Vietnamese defenders. On February 7, 1965, Viet Cong forces attacked the American compound at Pleiku in the Central Highlands, killing 8 Americans and wounding over 100. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy happened to be visiting South Vietnam during the attack. He flew over the smoldering compound, then returned to Washington recommending sustained bombing of North Vietnam. Johnson, who had won the November election in a landslide partly by promising not to send American boys to fight an Asian war, now prepared to do exactly that. Operation Rolling Thunder began on March 2, 1965, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would continue, with occasional pauses, for 3 years. The campaign's goals were to break Hanoi's will, force them to stop supporting the Southern insurgency, and boost South Vietnamese morale. None of these objectives would be achieved. Instead, the bombing stiffened North Vietnamese resolve, drove them closer to China and the Soviet Union, and demonstrated to the insurgency that America could be defeated despite its overwhelming firepower. The bombing campaign required protecting American air bases in South Vietnam. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 Marines landed at Da Nang, becoming the first American combat troops officially deployed to Vietnam. The war's nature had fundamentally changed, from an advisory mission to an American war. July 28, 1965. President Lyndon Johnson stood before reporters in the East Room of the White House, his voice heavy with resignation, as he announced that American troop levels in Vietnam would immediately increase from 75,000 to 125,000, with additional forces to follow as needed. He had rejected the advice of Undersecretary of State George Ball, who warned that sending combat troops meant, "We'll be bogged down in a long war that won't be immediately decisive." Johnson understood Ball might be right, but he feared the political consequences of being the first president to lose a war. "I don't think it's worth fighting for," Johnson privately told McNamara, "and I don't think we can get out. It's just the biggest damn mess." The American military buildup transformed Vietnam into a massive conventional war. By December 1965, American troop strength reached 184,000. A year later, nearly 400,000 American soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors served in Vietnam. By April 1969, the peak deployment reached 543,000. This represented the largest American military commitment since World War II. Yet it fought against an enemy without a conventional industrial base, without an air force, and without a navy. General William Westmoreland, commanding the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, devised a strategy of attrition. He believed American forces could inflict casualties faster than North Vietnam could replace them. Search and destroy operations sent American units sweeping through the countryside, seeking enemy forces to engage with superior firepower. Artillery, helicopter gunships, tactical air support, and strategic bombers would kill communists faster than they could infiltrate. Eventually, Westmoreland believed Hanoi would recognize the futility of continuing and negotiate a favorable settlement. This strategy contained fatal flaws that critics like Ball and Senator William Fulbright identified early. North Vietnam possessed an advantage invisible on Westmoreland's organizational charts: time. They fought for reunification of their homeland and could sustain losses indefinitely. As North Vietnamese General Von Nguyen Giap later explained, "Every minute, hundreds of thousands of people die. The life or death of 100, 1,000, or tens of thousands of human beings, even if they are compatriots, represents really very little." This calculus horrified Americans, but it reflected a harsh reality. Hanoi would accept staggering casualties before surrendering. The Ho Chi Minh Trail exemplified North Vietnam's determination. Despite facing the most intensive bombing campaign in history, more tonnage dropped than in all of World War II, the trail continued functioning. American reconnaissance photographed truck convoys and B-52 bombers carpet-bombed suspected concentrations, yet supplies kept flowing. North Vietnamese laborers, many of them women, repaired damage overnight. As reported in John Prados's The Blood Road, the trail eventually moved 100 tons of supplies and 5,000 infiltrators southward daily, despite relentless American air attacks. American combat operations achieved tactical victories but strategic stalemate. Marines landed at Chu Lai in May 1965. The 1st Cavalry Division deployed to the Central Highlands in September. The 173rd Airborne Brigade conducted operations around Saigon. These units won virtually every conventional engagement. The November 1965 Battle of Ia Drang Valley demonstrated both American superiority in conventional combat and the war's essential futility. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's battalion fought surrounded North Vietnamese regulars to a standstill, calling in devastating airstrikes that killed perhaps 1,200 enemy soldiers against 79 American deaths. Yet strategic victory remained elusive. After every battle, American forces withdrew to their bases while Communist forces melted back into the jungle, buried their dead, and received replacements from the north. Villages supposedly pacified reverted to Communist control after American forces departed. Body counts, the metric Westmoreland used to measure progress, proved notoriously unreliable. Commanders inflated numbers to demonstrate success. Civilians killed in bombing raids or artillery strikes were counted as enemy combatants. The infamous order to destroy the village to save it reflected the war's moral corrosion. The Phoenix program, launched in 1967, attempted to destroy the NLF's political infrastructure through targeted operations. CIA and Special Forces advisors worked with South Vietnamese units to identify and neutralize communist cadres. According to William Colby, who later directed the program, Phoenix neutralized over 81,000 Viet Cong between 1968 and 1972. But the program devolved into an assassination campaign where personal vendettas and corruption often determined targets. Innocent villagers died alongside genuine communist organizers, creating new grievances that fueled recruitment. Meanwhile, dissent in America grew rapidly. The civil rights movement, increasingly radicalized, connected racism at home with imperialism abroad. Martin Luther King Jr. denounced the war in his April 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam, calling America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Students burned draft cards on college campuses. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Protesters chanted outside the White House. The October 1967 march on the Pentagon drew 100,000 demonstrators. By late 1967, Johnson's advisors were deeply divided. The war was costing $30 billion annually, money needed for Johnson's Great Society programs. Casualties mounted weekly. Yet Westmoreland kept requesting more troops, promising victory was just over the horizon. In November 1967, Westmoreland returned to Washington to assure Congress and the public that the war was being won. "We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view," he declared. Within weeks, events would prove his optimism catastrophically misplaced. January 31st, 1968. As Vietnamese families celebrated Tet, the Lunar New Year, and Vietnam's most important holiday, Communist forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. Sappers blasted through the wall of the American embassy in Saigon at 2:47 in the morning, initiating a firefight that lasted 6 hours. Simultaneous attacks struck Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the presidential palace, and Saigon's radio station. In the old imperial capital of Hue, 10,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops seized and held the city for 25 days in brutal urban combat. The Tet Offensive shattered American assumptions about the war and transformed domestic political calculations, ultimately driving Johnson from office. The offensive represented years of planning by Hanoi's leadership. General Giap envisioned attacks on such scale and audacity that they would trigger a general uprising among South Vietnam's population. Communist forces had infiltrated cities disguised as refugees and peasants bringing Tet goods to market. They smuggled weapons in false-bottomed vegetable trucks, in coffins during fake funeral processions, even in flower carts. The coordination required, launching simultaneous attacks across a country the size of California, demonstrated sophisticated command and control, despite American technological superiority. American and South Vietnamese forces quickly recovered from the initial shock and inflicted devastating casualties on the attackers. No general uprising occurred. Within days, Communist forces were driven from most urban areas except Hue. The battle for Hue became the war's longest and bloodiest urban combat. Marines fought house to house through the ancient citadel, as North Vietnamese regulars defended prepared positions with remarkable tenacity. American commanders, initially reluctant to damage the historic city, eventually called in artillery and airstrikes that reduced much of Hue to rubble. When fighting finally ended on March 3rd, 5,000 communist soldiers lay dead, along with 216 American troops and over 400 South Vietnamese soldiers. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a communist disaster. They suffered perhaps 40,000 killed, losses so catastrophic that Viet Cong units were decimated, and North Vietnamese regulars had to assume primary combat responsibility going forward. No cities remained in communist hands. The hoped-for general uprising never materialized. Most South Vietnamese civilians, far from joining the revolution, simply tried to survive the fighting. Yet Tet represented a massive political and psychological victory for Hanoi. It exposed the credibility gap between optimistic official statements and battlefield reality. Americans watching evening news saw fighting at their own embassy, a powerful symbol that nowhere in South Vietnam was secure. The respected CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam, concluded his February 27th broadcast by stating, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." When Johnson watched this broadcast, he reportedly said, If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. The offensive also revealed horrifying war crimes. During their occupation of Hue, Communist forces systematically executed approximately 3,000 South Vietnamese officials, intellectuals, priests, and anyone associated with the government or Americans. Bodies were discovered in mass graves for months after the battle. But American atrocities received more attention. In March 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the hamlet of My Lai, including women, children, and elderly. The massacre remained hidden until November 1969, when journalist Seymour Hersh exposed it, further eroding public support for the war. The Pentagon requested 206,000 additional troops to exploit Tet's military results and finally defeat communist forces. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, recently appointed to replace Robert McNamara, who had turned against the war, commissioned a study of this request. The results shocked him. The study concluded that meeting Westmoreland's requests would require mobilizing reserves, dramatically increasing costs, and extending tours of duty, all without any guarantee of victory. The existing strategy of attrition simply wasn't working. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson addressed the nation. He announced a partial bombing halt to encourage negotiations, acknowledged that America needed a new approach, and then stunned viewers by declaring, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The war had destroyed Johnson's presidency. His Great Society programs were starved of funding. Campus protests grew increasingly violent. His own Democratic Party was fragmenting. Rather than face a brutal primary campaign against Senator Eugene McCarthy, whose anti-war campaign had nearly won New Hampshire, Johnson withdrew. The war ground on with no end visible. Paris peace talks began in May 1968, but quickly stalemated over procedural issues. North Vietnam refused to accept any settlement that left a non-communist government in the South. The Nixon administration, taking office in January 1969, pursued Vietnamization, building up South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. But secret documents leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, the Pentagon Papers, revealed that multiple administrations had systematically lied about the war's progress and prospects. By 1968, the fundamental question that had launched American involvement remained unanswered. Was preventing communist control of South Vietnam worth the costs America was paying? April 30th, 1975. Ambassador Graham Martin climbed aboard a helicopter on the roof of the American embassy in Saigon as North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the city's streets below. The iconic image, desperate Vietnamese clinging to helicopters while Americans evacuated, symbolized the humiliating end of America's longest war. After 3 decades of conflict, 2 million Vietnamese deaths, 58,000 American deaths, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent, Vietnam was unified under communist control. The question of what caused this catastrophe haunted American foreign policy for generations. The Paris Peace Accord signed on January 27, 1973, provided America a face-saving exit, but guaranteed South Vietnam's eventual defeat. North Vietnamese forces remained in the South, while American troops withdrew. The agreement's provisions for political reconciliation and internationally supervised elections were meaningless without enforcement mechanisms. President Richard Nixon privately assured South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that America would intervene if North Vietnam violated the accords. But Nixon's resignation during the Watergate scandal in August 1974 and congressional restrictions on military involvement made such intervention impossible. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in January 1975, South Vietnam's collapse came with stunning speed. The army that America had equipped with modern weapons and trained for years disintegrated. Soldiers deserted en masse, desperate to evacuate their families from threatened areas. Commanders abandoned their units. Corruption and incompetence, tolerated for years because American advisors and firepower compensated for South Vietnamese weaknesses, proved fatal once Americans departed. Province after province fell with minimal resistance. Saigon, which American planners expected to hold for years, fell in just 55 days. Understanding what caused America's failure in Vietnam requires examining multiple levels of causation. At the surface level, immediate factors included tactical mistakes, strategic confusion, and political constraints. But deeper historical currents, colonialism's legacy, nationalism's power, and Cold War ideology, created the conditions for conflict. France's colonial exploitation generated Vietnamese nationalism that transcended communist ideology. Ho Chi Minh's movement succeeded because it positioned itself as the champion of independence, not because most Vietnamese embraced Marxism-Leninism. When America inherited France's position as the foreign power supporting a client government in South Vietnam, it inherited an impossible task. No amount of military force could create legitimacy for a regime most Vietnamese viewed as a foreign imposition. The domino theory that drove American intervention proved fundamentally flawed. American policymakers believed monolithically. They failed to recognize that nationalist movements varied enormously in strength and character across different countries. Vietnam's fall to communism did not trigger the predicted collapse of Southeast Asia. Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia remained non-communist. The dominoes didn't fall because they were never really dominoes. Each country's fate depended on its specific circumstances, not mechanical inevitability. American military strategy mismatched the war's essential nature. Westmoreland's Adder-Ishin strategy assumed North Vietnam would calculate costs and benefits rationally according to Western logic. But Ho Chi Minh's government fought for reunification with revolutionary fervor that accepted unlimited sacrifice. As Vietnamese communist leader Le Duan stated, "We will win because we are willing to pay the price, and you are not." The United States possessed overwhelming military superiority, yet this advantage proved irrelevant in a political struggle for legitimacy and popular support. The Saigon government's fundamental weakness doomed American efforts from the beginning. Despite massive American aid, South Vietnam never developed effective governance or commanded genuine popular loyalty. Corruption permeated every level. Officers purchased their commands and embezzled from their troops. Officials extorted bribes from desperate civilians. Land reform programs failed because wealthy landowners, often connected to government officials, blocked meaningful redistribution. When offered a choice between a corrupt, oppressive government backed by foreigners and a disciplined revolutionary movement promising land and dignity, many Vietnamese peasants chose the revolution. American domestic politics imposed constraints that made victory impossible under any strategy Hanoi would accept. After Tet, public opinion turned decisively against the war. Congress increasingly restricted military operations and cut funding. The anti-war movement, initially small and radical, grew into a mainstream phenomenon encompassing millions of Americans who concluded the war was not worth the costs. Presidents could not mobilize the total national commitment that defeating North Vietnam would have required because the American people, quite reasonably, did not believe South Vietnam's fate warranted such sacrifice. The broader Cold War context created perverse incentives. Both the Soviet Union and China provided North Vietnam with weapons, economic aid, and diplomatic support, assistance that continued despite the Sino-Soviet split. This support meant North Vietnam could sustain losses indefinitely. Meanwhile, America's Cold War concerns prevented adopting strategies that might have worked militarily, but risked wider war. Invading North Vietnam risked Chinese intervention, as in Korea. Mining Haiphong Harbor risked sinking Soviet ships. Nuclear weapons were obviously unusable. American power was constrained by fear of escalation, while North Vietnamese power was sustained by communist allies. Racial and class dimensions of the draft created profound domestic tensions. Educated, affluent Americans could obtain deferments or assignments to safe positions. The burden fell disproportionately on working-class and minority youth. African Americans, who comprised 11% of the population, represented 23% of combat deaths in 1965. Project 100,000, which lowered recruitment standards, sent poorly educated men, disproportionately minorities, into combat. This inequity undermined the war's legitimacy and fueled the anti-war movement. The war's moral dimensions haunted America. Tactics like free fire zones, body counts, and strategic hamlet programs that forcibly relocated peasants violated American values while proving counterproductive. Herbicides like Agent Orange destroyed croplands and forests, creating environmental devastation while failing to deny cover to guerrillas who simply adapted. The use of napalm, jellied gasoline that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees, against villages produced horrifying civilian casualties captured in iconic photographs like Nick Utt's image of 9-year-old Phanthi Kim Phuc fleeing her burning village. Looking back from decades later, historians generally conclude that multiple American administrations, from Truman through Nixon, made fundamentally flawed decisions rooted in Cold War assumptions that oversimplified complex political realities. Eisenhower's support for Diem prevented the Geneva Accords' promised elections. Kennedy dramatically expanded the advisory mission. Johnson escalated to full-scale war. Nixon widened the conflict to Cambodia and Laos while publicly promising withdrawal. Each administration inherited commitments from its predecessor and feared the domestic political consequences of being the first to lose a war. Yet alternative paths existed at every juncture. In 1945, America could have supported Vietnamese independence rather than French colonialism. In 1954, America could have accepted the Geneva Accords election provisions. In 1963, America could have pressured Diem toward genuine reform rather than supporting his overthrow. In 1965, America could have negotiated a neutral South Vietnam rather than committing combat troops. Each decision narrowed future options until leaders felt trapped by past commitments. The war's consequences extended far beyond Southeast Asia. 58,220 American deaths traumatized families and communities. 304,000 Americans wounded carried physical and psychological scars for life. Veterans returning home faced indifference or hostility rather than gratitude, developing PTSD at unprecedented rates. Agent Orange exposure caused cancers and birth defects decades later. The war destroyed America's post-World War II consensus on foreign policy, bred cynicism about government, contributed to stagflation and economic decline, and divided society in ways still visible today. For Vietnam, unification brought neither peace nor prosperity. The communist government's harsh policies, re-education camps for former South Vietnamese officials, collectivization of agriculture, suppression of private enterprise, impoverished the country. Hundreds of thousands fled as boat people, risking death at sea rather than living under communist rule. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December 1978 to overthrow the genocidal Khmer Rouge, then fought a brief but bloody border war with China in February 1979. Economic stagnation persisted until market reforms in the 1980s. What really caused the Vietnam War? At its deepest level, the war emerged from the collision between Vietnamese nationalism seeking independence and unification, French colonialism attempting to maintain empire, and American Cold War ideology that interpreted all conflicts through the lens of communist expansion. Each party's decisions, rooted in their particular historical circumstances and ideological frameworks, created cascading consequences that escalated a local anti-colonial struggle into a devastating international conflict. France's refusal to grant independence, America's domino theory assumptions, and Hanoi's absolute commitment to reunification formed an explosive combination that no amount of military force could resolve. The ultimate tragedy was that the war proved unnecessary. The communist victory in 1975 did not lead to regional collapse. Vietnam today maintains diplomatic and economic relations with the United States. Former adversaries trade extensively and cooperate on security issues. The outcome that cost millions of lives could have been achieved through negotiated settlement at any point, avoiding decades of suffering. As former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara acknowledged in his memoir, In Retrospect, published in 1995, "We were wrong, terribly wrong." That simple admission, coming 2 decades after the war's end, crystallized a painful historical lesson. Even great powers with noble intentions can stumble into catastrophic wars when ideology blinds them to political reality, when military means are mismatched to political ends, and when leaders lack the courage to change course despite mounting evidence of failure. The Vietnam War's shadow still stretches across American foreign policy, shaping debates about military intervention, nation-building, and the limits of American power. Its lessons, about the importance of understanding local political dynamics, the danger of ideological rigidity, the need for clear achievable objectives, and the ultimate futility of imposing solutions through military force on unwilling populations, remain relevant as new generations of leaders confront complex international challenges. What caused the Vietnam War was not any single decision or event, but rather a tragic convergence of imperial ambition, ideological conflict, nationalist aspiration, and human fallibility that transformed a small Southeast Asian country into a graveyard for millions and a symbol of the catastrophic consequences when great powers misjudge, miscalculate, and refuse to learn until the price becomes unbearable.